There's a saying in the American South: the blues had a baby and they named it rock and roll. But where did the blues come from? To answer that question, we need to travel to a place where the earth is as rich as it is troubled, where the soil holds cotton and memories in equal measure, where joy and suffering walked hand in hand for generations. This is the story of how centuries of pain, resilience, creativity, and hope transformed into one of America's most powerful cultural exports. This is the story of how enslaved people and their descendants took the worst of human cruelty and forged something beautiful, something that would change music forever. This is the story of Mississippi, from slavery to the blues. Before we understand the music, we need to understand the land. Mississippi's geography shaped everything: the economy, the culture, and ultimately, the music that would be born here. The Mississippi Delta is not actually a delta in the geological sense. It's an alluvial plain, a vast floodplain that stretches from Memphis, Tennessee, down to Vicksburg, Mississippi, roughly 200 miles long and 70 miles wide. For thousands of years, the Mississippi River flooded this land, depositing nutrient-rich sediment that created some of the most fertile soil on Earth. This richness would prove to be both a blessing and a curse. When European settlers arrived, they saw this land and recognized it as perfect for growing cotton. In the early 19th century, cotton was white gold, the most valuable commodity in the American economy. The Industrial Revolution in Britain had created an insatiable demand for raw cotton, and the Mississippi Delta could produce it in abundance. But there was a problem. Growing cotton required enormous amounts of labor. The climate was brutal: sweltering summers with temperatures regularly exceeding 95 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity that made the air feel like a wet blanket, and diseases like malaria and yellow fever that thrived in the swampy lowlands. The solution that wealthy landowners chose was one of history's greatest moral catastrophes: chattel slavery on a massive scale. Mississippi became a slave state when it joined the Union in 1817, but slavery had existed in the region since the early 18th century under French and Spanish colonial rule. When American settlers poured in after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, they brought the institution of slavery with them and expanded it dramatically. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, Mississippi had approximately 436,000 enslaved people and only about 354,000 white residents. In the Delta counties, the disproportion was even more extreme. In some areas, enslaved people outnumbered white residents 10 to 1. These weren't just statistics, these were human beings, families torn apart on auction blocks, children sold away from their mothers. People worked from sunrise to sunset, their bodies commodities, their humanity denied, their dreams deferred. The typical day for an enslaved person on a Mississippi cotton plantation began before dawn. Men, women, and often children as young as 8 or 9 would be awakened by the overseer's horn or bell. They would grab a quick breakfast, usually cornmeal mush or molasses, and then head to the fields. During planting season in spring, they would prepare soil and plant cotton seeds. During the growing season, they would chop weeds with hoes under the merciless sun. But the hardest time was picking season, from late August through November. Each person was expected to pick 150 to 200 pounds of cotton per day. Those who failed to meet their quota faced punishment, whipping, reduced rations, or worse. The work didn't end when they left the fields. Women would cook, clean, and care for children. Men might be required to do additional tasks, repairing tools, building fences, cutting wood. Sunday was typically the only day with reduced labor, and even then, enslaved people were expected to tend their own small garden plots or do personal chores. The physical brutality was matched by psychological trauma. Enslaved people lived under constant threat of violence. Families could be separated at any moment if the enslaver decided to sell someone. Learning to read was prohibited. In Mississippi, it was illegal to teach enslaved people literacy. Any form of resistance, even perceived disrespect, could result in severe punishment. And yet, and this is crucial to understanding what came next, they survived, not just physically, but spiritually and culturally. They maintained their humanity in the face of a system designed to strip it away. And they did it, in large part, through music. Music was not a luxury for enslaved people in Mississippi. It was a lifeline. It was communication, resistance, solace, joy, and memory, all woven together in melody and rhythm. The musical traditions that enslaved people brought with them from Africa were rich and diverse. Different regions of West and Central Africa, from Senegal to Angola, had their own musical styles, but they shared common elements that would prove crucial to the development of the blues. African music emphasized rhythm in complex, polyrhythmic patterns that European music rarely explored. It featured call and response structures, where a leader would sing a line and the group would respond. It used pentatonic and blues-like scales, rather than the standard European major and minor scales. It incorporated bent notes, slides, and vocal techniques that expressed emotion in ways that straight tones could not. Instruments were both remembered and recreated. Enslaved people couldn't bring instruments with them across the Middle Passage, but they carried the knowledge of how to make them. They crafted banjos. The ancestor of the modern banjo was an African instrument called the akonting or zalam. They made drums when they could, though drums were often prohibited by slaveholders who feared they could be used for communication and organizing rebellion. They made music with their bodies, hand clapping, foot stomping, bone rattling. They made music with their voices, field hollers, work songs, spirituals. The work song was particularly important. When dozens of people were hoeing a field or picking cotton, coordinated rhythm made the work more efficient. But more than that, work songs transformed the unbearable into something communal. A song leader would call out a line, and the workers would respond, often timing their movements to the rhythm. These work songs had multiple purposes. On the surface, they helped coordinate labor, but encoded within them were often messages, warnings about overseers, communications about plans, expressions of resistance. A song about Moses leading people out of Egypt was also a song about the Underground Railroad. A song about Jordan River wasn't just spiritual, it was geographical, referring to the Ohio River and freedom beyond it. Field hollers were more individual. A lone worker might cry out across the fields, a long melismatic call that communicated location, emotion, or simply asserted their existence as a human being in a system that tried to reduce them to property. These hollers used sliding notes, bent pitches, and emotional intensity that would become defining characteristics of the blues. Spirituals emerged from the forced Christianization of enslaved people. Slaveholders used Christianity as a tool of control, emphasizing biblical passages about obedience and accepting one's lot. But enslaved people transformed Christianity into something liberating. They focused on the Exodus story, on Jesus as liberator, on a heaven where they would be free. The spirituals they created were profoundly moving. They used African musical elements, call and response, syncopation, bent notes, but wrapped them in Christian imagery. They sang of burdens being lifted, of crossing over Jordan, of freedom coming, and crucially, they improvised. African musical tradition emphasized improvisation and personal expression within a communal framework. A spiritual might have a basic structure, but each singer could add their own variations, their own emotional inflections, their own creativity. This improvisational spirit would become fundamental to the blues and jazz. The Civil War ended slavery in 1865, but it did not end suffering in Mississippi. If anything, the period that followed was in some ways even more complex and difficult for Black Mississippians. Reconstruction, the period from 1860 to 1877, briefly offered hope. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution abolished slavery, granted citizenship to formerly enslaved people, and gave Black men the right to vote. In Mississippi, Black men voted in large numbers and even held political office. Hiram Revels became the first African American U.S. Senator representing Mississippi from 1870 to 1871. But white supremacists violently resisted Reconstruction. The Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations murdered Black political leaders, intimidated voters, and destroyed Black communities. When federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877, Reconstruction collapsed. What followed was the Jim Crow era, a system of illegal segregation and disenfranchisement that would last until the 1960s. Mississippi led the nation in creating laws designed to suppress Black freedom. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and violence prevented Black citizens from voting. Segregation laws mandated separate schools, restaurants, water fountains, and virtually every public accommodation, with the facilities for Black citizens always inferior. Economically, most Black Mississippians found themselves trapped in sharecropping, a system that was often slavery by another name. Landowners would provide land, seeds, and supplies to sharecroppers, who would grow and harvest cotton. In theory, after the harvest, the crop would be divided between landowner and sharecropper, with the sharecropper paying back their debt for supplies. In practice, the system was rigged. Landowners controlled the accounting. They ran plantation stores where sharecroppers had to buy supplies at inflated prices. Interest rates were astronomical. Year after year, sharecroppers would finish the harvest only to be told they were still in debt and had to work another year to pay it off. The work was the same backbreaking labor their ancestors had performed in slavery. The cabins were the same decrepit shacks. The diet was the same limited fare: cornmeal, molasses, salt pork, whatever they could grow in their small garden plots. Violence enforced the system. Black men who tried to leave before their debt was paid could be arrested for vagrancy and forced to work on chain gangs. Those who protested or stood up for their rights faced lynch mobs. Between 1877 and 19 Mississippi had more lynchings than any other state, at least 581 documented cases, though the real number was likely higher. And yet, black Mississippians continued to create, to survive, to find joy where they could. Saturday nights might bring a fish fry, a juke joint, music and dancing. Sunday brought church, with its powerful singing and community. And throughout the week, there was music in the fields, on street corners, at social gatherings. The music was evolving. It still carried the African traditions, the field hollers, the spirituals, but now it was incorporating new influences. Formerly, enslaved people had been exposed to military music during the Civil War. The brass bands, the marches, the structured European harmonies. They'd heard minstrel shows, which, despite their racist caricatures, had exposed them to popular American songs and new instruments. Guitars became more available in the late 19th century as mass production made them affordable. The guitar was perfect for the blues that was emerging: portable, versatile, capable of the bent notes and slides that singers wanted, able to accompany a lone voice or a group. And the economic and social conditions of Jim Crow Mississippi created the emotional context that would make the blues not just possible, but necessary. The blues didn't have a single birth date or creator. It emerged gradually in the late 19th and early 20th centuries across the South, but nowhere more powerfully than in the Mississippi Delta. The blues represented something new in music, a secular, highly personal form that spoke directly to the lived experience of black Southerners after slavery. While spirituals looked toward heaven, the blues looked at the here and now. It dealt with love and heartbreak, with poverty and injustice, with travel and leaving, with Saturday night and Sunday morning, with the whole complicated reality of black life in Jim Crow America. The musical structure of the blues was deceptively simple, yet infinitely flexible. The classic blues form used 12 bars of music divided into 3 4-bar phrases. The lyrical structure often followed an AAB pattern. The first line stated a situation or feeling. The second line repeated it with variation, and the third line provided a response, twist, or resolution. But within this structure was tremendous room for individual expression. Blues singers and players bent notes, playing or singing pitches that fell between the standard notes of the Western scale, creating the blue notes that gave the music its distinctive sound. They used slides, vibrato, and vocal growls. They incorporated field hollers, work song rhythms, and spiritual intensity. The lyrics were poetry of the common people. They used imagery from daily life: trains, floods, rivers, cotton, jails, traveling, working, loving. They employed double meanings and metaphors that could speak to multiple realities simultaneously. A song about a train leaving the station could be about literal travel, about a lover leaving, or about the desire to escape the South entirely. Early blues musicians were often itinerant performers who moved from plantation to plantation, town to town. They might work in the fields during the week and play at a juke joint on Saturday night. They might perform on street corners for tips or at house parties. This mobility was part of the blues culture, the restless movement, the yearning for something better somewhere else. The juke joint was the primary venue for the blues. These were informal establishments, often just someone's house or a rough wooden building, where black folks could gather on weekends. They'd drink, gamble, dance, and listen to music. Juke joints operated outside white society's control, which made them spaces of relative freedom, but also made them targets for police harassment and violence. In the juke joint, the blues performer was king for a night. A good blues musician could read the crowd, gauge the mood, and deliver exactly what people needed: a fast dance number to get people moving, a slow blues to match the melancholy of hard times, a funny song to bring laughter, a risque number to add spice to the evening. The early blues was also shaped by the brutal economics of sharecropping. Many blues songs dealt with poverty, debt, and the impossibility of getting ahead. They sang about going down to the captain to settle debts, about boll weevils destroying cotton crops, about wearing worn out clothes and living in broken down shacks. The blues also chronicled love and relationships in frank, often sexually suggestive terms that would have been unthinkable in white popular music of the era. Blues singers sang about desire, infidelity, heartbreak, and resilience in relationships, reflecting the full complexity of human experience. Importantly, the blues was not just about sadness. The very act of singing the blues was an act of resistance and affirmation. By naming pain, by transforming suffering into art, blues musicians asserted their humanity. They took the blues, the feeling of sadness and oppression, and made the blues a powerful cultural form that would spread around the world. The Mississippi Delta developed its own distinctive blues style, characterized by raw emotion, intense guitar work, and deeply personal lyrics. Delta blues was often performed by solo artists accompanying themselves on guitar, creating an intimate, intense sound. The guitar techniques developed by Delta blues players were revolutionary. They used slide guitar extensively, placing a bottleneck, knife blade, or metal slide on a finger to create smooth gliding between notes that mimicked the human voice. They developed finger-picking patterns that allowed them to play bass lines, chords, and melody simultaneously, making a solo guitar sound almost like multiple instruments. They also innovated tunings, moving beyond standard guitar tuning to create open tunings that made slide playing easier and created different tonal possibilities. These alternate tunings gave Delta blues its distinctive sound and allowed players to create complex music despite often having limited formal training. The Delta blues was deeply connected to specific places. Clarksdale, Mississippi, became a blues epicenter, sitting at the intersection of highways 61 and 49. According to legend, this was the crossroads where musicians might make a deal with the devil to gain supernatural musical ability, a myth that reflected both the seemingly impossible skill of great blues players and the Christian community's sometimes suspicious view of secular music. The Dockery Plantation near Ruleville was another crucial location. This large cotton plantation had a relatively more permissive atmosphere that allowed blues music to flourish. Many blues musicians either worked there or visited regularly to learn from others. Beale Street in Memphis, Tennessee, while just across the state line, was the commercial hub for Delta blues musicians. They would travel to Memphis to buy instruments, records, and supplies, and to perform for urban audiences who had more money to spend. The themes of Delta blues reflected the specific experience of the region. Many songs dealt with floods. The Mississippi River periodically devastated Delta communities, with the Great Flood of 1927 being particularly catastrophic. Blues songs chronicled the disaster, the suffering, and the rebuilding. They sang about the levee camps, where black men performed the brutal work of building and maintaining the earthen walls that tried often unsuccessfully to hold back the river. These camps were like prisons, with harsh conditions and little freedom. They sang about leaving. The Great Migration was beginning, with black Southerners moving north to Chicago, Detroit, and other industrial cities seeking better opportunities and escape from Jim Crow. Many blues songs expressed the tension between the desire to leave and the ties to home, family, and familiar places. The Delta blues also dealt with the legal system, a source of terror and injustice for black Mississippians. Songs about jails, chain gangs, and run-ins with law enforcement were common. The legal system was another tool of white supremacy, and blues musicians chronicled its abuses while also celebrating those who outwitted or escaped it. Delta blues musicians developed a reputation for rough living, drinking, gambling, womanizing, and sometimes violence. This lifestyle was partly a reaction to the limited options available to black men in the Delta, partly a rejection of middle-class respectability that many blues musicians associated with acceptance of oppression, and partly the reality of lives lived in juke joints and on the road. But it would be wrong to see Delta blues musicians only through this lens. They were also sophisticated artists, innovators who developed new musical techniques, poets who captured the complexity of their world, and business people who understood how to make a living from their art. The Delta blues was fundamentally about authenticity, about telling the truth of lived experience without sugarcoating or apology. It rejected the musical and social conventions that white society tried to impose. It created its own aesthetic, its own standards of excellence, its own tradition. While the blues tradition was communal and many musicians contributed to its development, certain figures emerged whose talent, innovation, and influence were so profound that they became legendary. Charlie Patton, born in the 1890s, is often called the father of the Delta blues. He worked at Dockery Plantation and became known for his powerful, gravelly voice and innovative guitar technique. Patton was as much showman as musician, He would play guitar behind his back, between his legs, and with the instrument lying flat on his lap. His performances were events, drawing large crowds across the Delta. Patton's influence extended beyond his playing. He mentored younger musicians, including several who would become blues legends themselves. His repertoire was vast, including blues, spirituals, ragtime, and popular songs, showing that early blues musicians drew from multiple traditions. Son House, born in 1902, brought a preacher's intensity to the blues. He had actually been a Baptist preacher before turning fully to blues music, and that spiritual fervor infused his performances. Playing slide guitar in open tunings, House created a raw, emotionally devastating sound. His approach to the blues was almost religious in its intensity. He sang with conviction and passion that could move audiences to tears or ecstasy. House's influence would be enormous, particularly on the next generation of blues musicians. His intense, uncompromising approach to the music set a standard for emotional authenticity in the blues. Skip James, born in 1902, was one of the most distinctive voices in Delta blues. Unlike many Delta musicians who played in standard or simple open tunings, James developed complex, minor key tunings that gave his music an eerie, haunting quality. His high, ethereal voice and intricate guitar work created blues that was beautiful and unsettling in equal measure. James's lyrics often dealt with darker themes: death, betrayal, spiritual torment, and his music had a sophistication that set it apart from more straightforward Delta blues. He was also accomplished on piano, showing the versatility of blues musicians who often played multiple instruments. Robert Johnson, though he only lived from 1911 to 1938, became perhaps the most famous Delta blues musician of all, partly due to his mysterious life and early death, but primarily due to his extraordinary talent. Johnson synthesized the Delta blues tradition, learning from Patton, House, and others, but created something uniquely his own. Johnson's guitar playing was remarkably sophisticated. He could create bass lines, chords, and melodic fills simultaneously, making his solo guitar performances sound like two instruments playing together. His voice ranged from smooth and sweet to rough and anguished, perfectly matching the emotional content of his lyrics. His songs became blues standards, covered by countless musicians over the decades. His lyrical imagery was vivid and powerful, and his songwriting craft was exceptional. He could tell complete stories in 3 minutes, create memorable characters, and express complex emotions with economy and precision. Johnson recorded only 29 songs over 2 sessions in 1936 and 1937, but those recordings would prove to be among the most influential in music history. When British and American rock musicians rediscovered blues in the 1960s, Johnson's recordings were a primary influence, affecting everyone from the Rolling Stones to Eric Clapton to Led Zeppelin. The legend of Johnson making a deal with the devil at the crossroads to gain his musical ability speaks to how his contemporaries viewed his seemingly supernatural talent. Of course, the reality was years of practice and learning from other musicians, but the myth persists because it captures something true: the sense that Johnson's music touched something beyond the ordinary. Mississippi. John Hurt, though he played in a gentler style than many Delta musicians, was another crucial figure. Born in 82, Hurt played a finger-picking guitar style that was more melodic and less raw than typical Delta blues, incorporating ragtime and country influences. His warm, conversational singing style and intricate guitar work offered a different shade of Mississippi blues. Big Joe Williams, Booka White, and others contributed to the rich tapestry of Mississippi blues in this era. Each brought their own style, their own innovations, their own voice to the tradition. These musicians, and many others whose names are less well known, created a body of work that documented their time, preserved African American musical traditions, and laid the foundation for much of 20th century popular music. While male musicians dominated the rural Delta blues scene, women were crucial to the broader blues tradition, particularly in urban and vaudeville blues. Ma Rainey, born in Georgia in 1886, became known as the mother of the blues. She performed throughout the South, including Mississippi, and her powerful voice and commanding stage presence made her one of the first professional blues singers. Rainey's performances brought blues to a wider audience through the vaudeville circuit, helping to popularize the form beyond juke joints and street corners. Bessie Smith, the Empress of the Blues, born in Tennessee in 1894, became the most popular blues singer of the 1920s and 1930s. Her recordings sold millions of copies, unprecedented for a black artist at the time. Smith's powerful voice could convey both strength and vulnerability, and her songs dealt frankly with love, sexuality, poverty, and injustice. These women and others, Memphis Minnie, who played guitar and sang with skill equal to any male contemporary, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who blended gospel and blues, demonstrated that blues was not exclusively a male domain. They brought their own perspectives, their own experiences as black women navigating a racist and sexist society to the blues tradition. Women blues singers often dealt with themes of female independence, sexual autonomy, and resistance to male domination, radical positions for their time. They sang about unfaithful men, about controlling their own sexuality, about making their own money and decisions in a society that tried to control and suppress black women. These blues singers claimed their voices and their agency. In Mississippi specifically, while fewer women performed in the rural juke joint circuit, they were central to the musical life of their communities. Women led church choirs, sang spirituals, maintained African American musical traditions in their homes and communities, and influenced the male musicians who would become famous. The blues existed for decades as purely live performance before it was recorded. The first blues recordings date to the 1920s, when record companies recognized that there was a market for race records, recordings marketed specifically to black audiences. Recording technology in the 1920s and early 1930s was primitive by modern standards. Early recordings were made acoustically. Musicians performed into a large horn that focused sound waves onto a cutting stylus that carved grooves into a wax master disc. The fidelity was limited, background noise was high, and the dynamic range was narrow. Recording companies would sometimes set up temporary studios in hotels in southern cities or bring portable recording equipment to the Delta. Musicians would travel to Memphis, Jackson, or other cities for recording sessions. These were often their only encounters with recording technology and sometimes they're only professional recordings. For many Delta blues musicians, recording was a one-time or rare occurrence. They might record a handful of songs, receive a flat fee, usually modest, perhaps $50 for a session, and return to their regular lives. They had no idea that these recordings might be preserved, studied, and revered decades later. The recordings that were made provide an invaluable historical record. They capture performances by musicians in their prime, preserve playing techniques and vocal styles, and document songs that might otherwise have been lost, but they also represent only a fragment of the rich musical culture of Mississippi. Many brilliant musicians were never recorded. Many songs were lost when recordings were poorly preserved or destroyed. The technological limitations meant that the raw power of live performance in a juke joint, the interaction with the audience, the full dynamic range, the extended improvisation was impossible to capture fully. Moreover, the recording industry was controlled by white businessmen who often exploited black musicians. The contracts were unfavorable, royalties were rarely paid fairly, and musicians had little control over how their work was used or marketed. Despite these limitations and injustices, the recordings that were made allowed the blues to reach beyond the Delta. Records could be purchased and played anywhere. They allowed the blues to influence musicians in Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and eventually around the world. Between 1916 and 19C, approximately 6 million black Americans left the South in what historians call the Great Migration. They moved north and west, seeking better jobs, escape from Jim Crow laws, and opportunities for their children. Mississippi was one of the major sources of this migration. Black Mississippians went primarily to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and other industrial cities in the North. They carried with them their culture, including their music. In Chicago particularly, Mississippi blues musicians found new audiences and new opportunities. The city already had a thriving black community and entertainment district. Blues clubs on the South Side became venues where Delta musicians could perform for audiences who understood and appreciated their music because they too had come from the South. But Chicago demanded evolution. The juke joint blues of the Delta, intimate, solo, or small group, acoustic, didn't work as well in noisy Chicago clubs. The solution was electrification, electric guitars, amplifiers, and eventually electric bass and drums transformed the blues. Mississippi musicians like Muddy Waters, born McKinley Morganfield in Rolling Fork, Mississippi in 1913, pioneered the Chicago electric blues style. Waters brought the intensity and authenticity of Delta blues, but amplified it, literally and figuratively. His bands featured electric guitar, harmonica, piano, bass, and drums, creating a powerful, driving sound. Howlin' Wolf, Chester Burnett, from White Station, Mississippi, brought his enormous physical presence and powerful voice to Chicago blues. His performances were electrifying, combining Delta traditions with urban sophistication. B.B. King, from Itabena, Mississippi, would develop a smoother, more polished urban blues style, featuring his distinctive guitar playing and smooth vocals. King became one of the most successful blues musicians of all time, bringing the blues to mainstream audiences. The Chicago blues influenced rock and roll directly. Chuck Berry, who was influenced by blues, created rock and roll by combining blues with country music and his own innovations. The British rock invasion of the 1960s, the Rolling Stones, the Yardbirds, Led Zeppelin, Cream, was built on electric Chicago blues, which itself was rooted in Mississippi Delta traditions. The blues tradition that emerged from slavery and Jim Crow in Mississippi became one of the most influential musical forms in modern history. Its influence extends far beyond blues itself into rock, soul, R&B, hip hop, and country music. The emotional directness of the blues, its insistence on authentic expression of genuine feeling, changed popular music permanently. Before blues, popular music often prioritized polish and propriety over raw emotion. After blues, audiences expected music to be emotionally real, to come from genuine experience. The musical innovations of blues, bent notes, slides, call and response, improvisation, syncopation, became fundamental techniques in rock, jazz, and soul music. The blues scale and blues progression are now basic building blocks of popular music worldwide. Mississippi has embraced this legacy. The Mississippi Blues Trail, established in 2006, marks important sites in blues history with blue markers throughout the state. Clarksdale hosts the Crossroads Blues Festival. The B.B. King Museum opened in Indianola. The Delta Blues Museum in Clarksdale preserves blues history and artifacts. Contemporary blues musicians continue to draw from the Mississippi tradition. Young musicians study the recordings of Robert Johnson, Son House, and others, learning their techniques and carrying the tradition forward. Blues festivals around the world feature Mississippi blues artists and celebrate the Delta blues legacy. But it's important to remember the context from which this music emerged. The blues was created by people who faced unspeakable cruelty, systemic oppression, and daily indignities. It emerged from slavery, from sharecropping, from Jim Crow, from poverty and violence. The blues represents the triumph of human creativity and spirit over oppression. It shows how people facing the worst circumstances can create beauty, can assert their humanity, can find joy and meaning. But we should never romanticize the suffering that created the context for this music. Mississippi's journey from slavery to the blues is a story of profound pain and remarkable creativity existing side by side. It's a story of how African musical traditions, carried across the ocean in the hulls of slave ships, survived and evolved through centuries of oppression. It's a story of how work songs in cotton fields, hollers across plantations, and spirituals in small churches became the foundation for a new art form. The blues emerged from a specific time and place. The Mississippi Delta in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but it spoke to something universal in human experience: the longing, the pain, the resilience, the hope, the humor in the face of hardship. These are emotions and experiences that resonate across cultures and generations. When we listen to Delta blues today, we're hearing echoes of slavery and its aftermath. We're hearing the voices of people who were denied basic human rights, but who refused to let their spirits be broken. We're hearing innovation and artistry created despite and in response to systematic oppression. The blues changed music forever. Rock and roll, soul, R&B, hip hop, none of these would exist without the blues. And the blues wouldn't exist without the specific historical experience of Black Mississippians who transformed their suffering into art. Mississippi's story is America's story in many ways. The story of our original sin of slavery, the failure of Reconstruction, the horrors of Jim Crow, but also the story of resistance, creativity, and the unstoppable human drive to create beauty and meaning even in the darkest circumstances. The blues had deep roots in Mississippi's troubled soil, and from those roots grew a tree whose branches now reach around the world, offering shade and fruit to everyone who listens. The blues is alive. The tradition continues, and Mississippi's musical legacy reminds us that out of great suffering can come great art, that the human spirit cannot be crushed, and that truth told through music has the power to change the world.